Before our journey gets back on track, it's time for a retrospective of our little detour. At the end of each major version, it's fun to revisit every step along the way, and of course, Nod Krai's case is a little special. We thought we knew our pathway through Teyvat since before it even started, but the plan did not become reality untouched. As always, this will all be grounded in my personal perspective and my experience of Nod Krai. If you're looking for objectivity, you might want to avoid discussions about games at all. It's all subjective, and anyone who claims otherwise is either lying to you or lying to themselves. And even compared to my previous retrospectives, I've been in a completely different headspace this past year. Through 2024 and into 25, I was slowly burning myself out on life in general, and Genshin wasn't as much of an escape as it had been before. My frustrations with Natlan Act 5 and with Mawika's characterization in particular didn't help. They left me feeling less engaged than I had been in years. The remaining patches had some fantastic high points, but my spark of hope was kindled by the livestream where Hoyo acknowledged many of the storytelling mistakes I'd found most frustrating and announced Nod Krai as their solution. Summer of 2025 was a particularly hard time, and I had reached a breaking point. And then my mum passed away, and I kinda just reset. For months, I felt completely disconnected, disembodied, and just struggling to figure out how to even exist in this new world. My health suffered, and I was forced to take a step back. Many of you might have noticed that since then my uploads on YouTube have been infrequent and irregular, and I've only streamed once since then. I'm still not entirely okay, but I am getting there bit by bit. Nod Krai, thankfully, turned out to be a welcome respite for me. Naturally, I didn't really go into Nod Krai with expectations, and instead it all started with a question. Could Hoyo actually deliver? I had a whole laundry list of problems with their storytelling which had bothered me for years, which I'd explored in a video before Natlan's Act 5 came out. The fact Hoyo had addressed it at all sparked hope, but the things they'd explicitly called out were ones I felt were less important, while the most pressing were not touched on whatsoever. They promised a melting pot with multiple competing factions in constant conflict with one another, and a fresh approach to storytelling aimed to make it feel more organic, more integrated into the world and the day-to-day experience. I felt they needed to get the basics right first: dialogue, characterization, pacing, promises and payoffs, and so on. The good parts of Natlan had those all spot on, but from my perspective at least, they had yet to meet the minimum requirements of quality storytelling across an entire region. The narrative had flashes of brilliance and the quality bar was rising, but it was still the other aspects of the game which kept me playing. I hoped Nod Krai would turn that on its head. In the interests of not treading the same ground yet again, there are several aspects of Nod Krai which I'll only briefly cover here. For each one, I have an entire video exploring it in depth, and in case the summary piques your interest, I'll add links in the description to each. It can be very fun to look back at thoughts and speculation with the benefit of hindsight, and it's kinda hilarious to see things I got completely spot on right alongside things where I was wildly incorrect. By the end of the first patch, I was already completely sold. The atmosphere was perfect, and while it didn't bring back the wanderlust I felt in Genshin's early days, it evoked a quiet echo which saw me love every minute I'd spent soaking up the scenery. The storytelling was fantastic too, easily my favorite opening act to a new region so far, and the characters were each compelling in their own way. I find it almost impossible to pick a favorite because they each inhabit such a different role. As always, there were still areas for improvement, but for the first time in forever, it felt like the devs had listened to long-standing complaints and figured out how to begin to fix them. After the first 6 acts, it felt like the right time to take a step back and assess whether the storytelling improvements Hoyo had promised were actually sticking beyond Nod Krai's promising beginning. For this, I went back to my original storytelling critique from back in Natlan and covered every single complaint I had made back then and tried to take an objective look at whether there was any measurable improvement. Obviously, you can't expect perfection, but you can demand visible effort. There were still some moments where they fell back into their same old flaws, but for the majority of the time there were obvious improvements. The crazy part for me was that even though I had been begging for them to make these exact changes for years, I was utterly unprepared for how big a difference each little change made when added all together. All those small improvements added up to make the story feel almost like a different game to me. Even after all that, there were still people dismissing Nod Krai as Genshin's filler arc. As always, I think it's important to understand what people with a different perspective are actually trying to say, and there are some interesting angles to Nod Krai from which it's reasonable to ask the question. I'd always argue that the doubters were not unreasonable to feel skeptical about Hoyo's motivations. But regardless of which perspective on the story you decide to pick, the initial premise, the actual premise, or different aspects of the wider narrative, in my opinion, Nod Krai is the opposite of filler. And then came the finale, the first time in Genshin's history that I went into the climax of a nation story expecting a satisfying conclusion, yet somehow they still managed to exceed my expectations. There are still aspects which I'd have wanted to be handled differently, and others where I think they fell back into their bad habits, but on the whole, it was fantastic, and most of my complaints were me wishing for a slightly different story rather than a better one. They kept the best parts of what they'd created in the past and added so much more into Nod Krai that it felt like a completely different game, but one which recaptures the soul which made so many fall in love with Teyvat in the first place. Central to that, of course, was Columbina Hyperselenia, who went from my least anticipated harbinger to one of my favorite characters in the game. I think the way they handled the slow, gradual progression of her character arc over the course of months of real-world time was fantastic, and it all tied together into a genuinely moving story in the end. Many of the moments were heartbreaking, and I couldn't help but love her. As I've said many times, I don't think her story is a masterpiece, but I think hers is a great example of a simple, meaningful story told with sincerity and soul, and I loved every minute. Next, the question of whether Nod Krai's exploration was simply too small to feel satisfying, and what the answer means looking forward to Snezhnaya. At the start of the region, many of us hoped to see more exploration this time around, especially with the tantalizing hope we'd get some long-awaited expansions to past regions. Instead, Nod Krai itself was rather small, and many felt it was too dense and compact to really feel compelling. For me, it emphasized that what matters is quality over quantity. I wished it had some more lush regions to match the stunning backgrounds in Lauma's domain, and felt that some of the exploration mechanics were too unpolished, but while I feel they overcorrected on density and the simplicity of traversal, and I still wish they'd add more challenging puzzles, I simply loved the time I spent wandering the world again. And then our return to Summaries. I was excited to see how they'd handle the weight of their past mistakes. Summaries is perhaps the region with the greatest depths of lore left relegated to its sprawling world quests, and it had so many open questions left unanswered by the end of its own series of Archon quests. Tying them together into a story which could work both for people who had skipped the lore and for people who had loved it seemed an even greater challenge than what they tackled elsewhere this year. The result was far from perfect, but it felt like a solid compromise to me, and it let them double down on the newfound strength of their storytelling from throughout Nod Krai. Overall, this year's Archon quest had a different balance compared to previous regions. In the past, while they had engaging storylines and fantastic high points, there was always a ton of content, which to me felt like it existed solely for the sake of eating up my time. In Nod Krai, even though the quests are longer, the quiet moments in between the hype were meaningful as well. They made a difference to the characters themselves, their relationships with one another, my perspective on them, my understanding of the world, and so on. Good writing aims to do several of those things at all times. Nod Krai was a joy to experience for me because it consistently delivered on this point. Some will argue that Nod Krai was boring because it spent too much time focusing on characters and not enough dealing with grand sweeping conflict or existential threats. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that perspective, as long as you acknowledge it's a question of personal preference. Personally, I loved it. The event stories were similarly consistent. Some of them feel less memorable than others, but there were several which stood out to me. For example, I expected the Clink Clank Clash one way back in the first Nod Krai patch to be just your typical intro to the new region filler, but the chemistry between Aino and Inefa made even that low-stakes story feel so much fun to me. Lantern Rite, as always, was a highlight. One thing which often feels missing from Genshin in general is for playable characters to have an abrasive edge to their personality, so I particularly enjoyed how Zebai's story built that in while still avoiding the risk of her feeling like a caricature. I'm still a little sad that the Lantern Rite aspect of it got shortchanged. I'd pick a meaningful character story with a rushed festival over an empty festival without that character growth. I just wish they'd give us both. But probably my favorite of the lot was the Phantasmal Pals quest. I find most of the chibi characters adorable, and the little Hexen circle was always going to appeal to me, but Prune's emotional journey was even better than I'd have hoped. Hoyo have told fantastic stories in time-limited events for years now, and it feels to me like they're getting more consistent. My biggest complaint has always been that they're only available for a limited time. It's fantastic that they now make some of the stories permanent. I just hope that they apply that to more of the smaller ones as well. One event which I feel a little more conflicted over, however, is Sunny Summer Fontanalia. Whenever someone asks me about my favorite past Genshin events, the summer events are always near the top. The second Golden Apple Archipelago and Simulanka especially, and I always look forward to some chill summer exploration. One thing which always felt missing, however, was that we never got an expansion of the archipelago which added underwater exploration. It's a perfect place for us to dive through vibrant coral reefs, and it would have added a fresh new take on that beloved location. Another event I loved was the Fontaine Film Festival with Ayaka and Yoimiya starring in a murder mystery, and I always wish they would bring it back. Lantern Rite gets a new iteration every year, and while they can't do that for every region's festival since it would get overcrowded, I still hope they'd bring them all back in rotation. And in addition, one dangling story thread I felt needed a very strong resolution was Sandroni's death and her expected return. While I'd argue that character death is not needed for a story to have stakes, when a character does die, it is important that any potential return is treated with appropriate gravity, with respect to how monumental an effect this has on the narrative. This year's summer event aimed at satisfying all three of those threads and only really succeeded in one for me. Instead of a new region to explore, we got a new take on underwater exploration which reused the existing areas. It was nice to go back there, and when played in small chunks over the course of several weeks, it was relaxing, but it still pales in comparison to what I really wanted. It finally brought back the film festival, and it was wonderful to see all our Fontainian friends once more, but much like this year's Lantern Rite, the festival side of the story took a back seat, and we ended up not getting quite the same experience as I'd have hoped for on that count. Instead, it focused much more on Sandroni's story. Of the three threads, this was the most important, and the story provided a moving and satisfying conclusion to that whole episode. I just wish it had been a separate character story, given the full focus of our attention without diluting those other sides of it. There was absolutely enough of a story there to justify it, and I'd argue it could have been far better if given more space. I'd imagine they merged all three due to time constraints. If they had to make a choice between all this and making sure Snesnaya meets expectations, then the new region obviously takes priority. It's a shame some things were shortchanged as a result, though thankfully the chill experience of diving through the familiar scenery with the gorgeous music in the background has been exactly what I needed, and despite these disappointments, it's been a highlight for me personally. As I covered in those more in-depth videos, the character stories this time around were kind of mixed for me. I thought Lauma's was done really well, seamlessly integrated into the main narrative. Flynn's was very short-changed and we barely got to know him at all. Neffa's was good, but its integration was pretty jarring. And of course, for me, Columbina's was the highlight. We also got dedicated separate quests for During, Varka, Linnea, all of which were pretty solid, plus Lohen, whose story kinda lost my interest in the end. Outside of all that, for me the world quests were perhaps Nod Krai's weakest point. Nutlands had been fantastic. The little buddy was an adorable companion who tied the disparate threads together, and several of the chapters were absolutely fantastic, especially the grand finale in the ancient sacred mountain. Nod Krai's had some cool areas and occasionally some interesting lore or characterization, but to me they came across as shallower than before. I'd assume this is just a casualty of how much lore was included in the Archon quests, and again, this is a trade-off I'd kinda have to approve of. For me at least, it's better to have more depth and nuance in the main story of the game, even if it means the side content is perhaps weaker. I'd hope they can raise the bar there again in the future without undoing the improvements to the Archon quests, but I'm skeptical it's something they really care enough about. Though that said, the ambient quest, where you explore the abandoned Apocalypse bunker, was fantastic, and Hoya did a far greater job at integrating cosmic horror than I'd ever have expected. And finally, a lot of Nod Krai's character interactions took place in the Traveler's Tales, Meeting Points, and also the Selenic Chronicles. If you experience these slices of story in the intended way, they make the entire world feel alive. It's a joy to stumble across a character moment when you least expect it, and having small pieces of progression which slowly build up over the course of a longer period of time helps forge a deeper connection to the characters than could really exist otherwise. The downside, however, is that these systems are built in a way which isn't as flexible as it should be. The Selenic Chronicles are a perfect example of both the positive and the negative sides to this. The original experience saw us talk to Columbina once per week in between the Archon quests. Her character growth went from something we saw during a few consecutive hours in the main story to an organic, slower experience we could see take place step by step with enough time in between to really make it feel like she was changing. And then, when she fell into the portal, her absence broke our comfortable routine and I felt the loss of her departure over and over again for an entire patch. But at the same time, I happened to start a few weeks late and the time gate prevented me from catching up. Once she returned, my weekly conversations no longer fit the continuity I experienced, as I played through her talking about wanting to go to the moon after we'd already been there. From what I've heard, the time gate is still in place, even though it means the experience is utterly broken for people who start the story now. They could easily play through the entirety of Nod Krai's Archon quest in the time between the first Selenic Chronicle and the time gate for the second one unlocking, so all of their positives would become an utter farce. The structure of these systems needs to be designed so that people playing on release get the intended experience, people who missed out can catch up while it's still releasing, and then people who start after can get something at least coherent, even if it's a pale echo of the original intent. Overall, I think these innovations have been a success, but they sure still have rough edges. One very significant quest, which I skipped talking about, was moon gazing, which sees us return to Columbina's moon along with a strange kuhenki, and then explore the strange and wonderful world up there. I've been taking this one slow, and I haven't completed it yet, but so far it's been awesome. It's so nice to have a voiced world quest. It makes such a difference to how engaging the experience feels. A point of contention on this, which I considered creating an entire video about, is that familiar question of whether such sci-fi ideas fit in Genshin, especially because I was pretty vocal in my dissatisfaction with how the tech was handled in Natlan. The first point I'd want to make is that the division between science fiction and fantasy is artificial, and ideas from both can live alongside each other perfectly well. Both genres explore ideas which do not exist in real life. Hard sci-fi explores technology and scenarios which are plausible. Soft sci-fi is essentially fantasy with sci-fi aesthetics. Fantasy has a similar concept too. Some stories rely on hard magic, where you know the exact rules and capabilities of the magic characters can use, and the fun part is seeing them solve problems using them. Others use soft magic, which exists to cause problems or perhaps evoke a sense of wonder, but rarely solves problems in a satisfying way. Stories which blend both genres can be incredible. Star Wars, for example, has robot and spaceflight and clone armies, but it also has the Force, the Jedi, and lightsabers. At its heart, it's a heroic story with fantastical world building, but with sci-fi trappings woven throughout. It was pretty clear from the very beginning that Teyvat was intended to embody that kind of balance. Ancient robots, soldiers with magitech guns, hints of great technological civilizations lost to a distant cataclysm. The problem, then, is whether any individual thing feels natural in the world we know. The technical term for this is an anachronism, a chronological inconsistency which makes something feel out of place in time. This is inherently subjective, and anachronisms which bother one person might feel perfectly natural to another. For example, take guns in war films. As someone who couldn't care less, as long as a gun looks roughly appropriate for the time period in which a film is set, it's not something I would notice. However, if you put Star Wars blasters in the hands of soldiers, it would absolutely break the illusion for me, though of course it could just become a completely different film. Meanwhile, many people have encyclopedic knowledge about guns who can identify the make and model and the year of release from just a glimpse. The moment they watch a film like Enemy at the Gates, a film set in 1942, and see the sniper holding a gun they know was not manufactured until 1943, it's going to bother them every time it's on the screen. I'd imagine the fact it's almost correct would be more irritating than if they'd given them the sci-fi gun, because the film aims to build up the illusion that we're watching history unfold and then breaks it by mistake. For many people, the technology wielded by the Natlan characters felt anachronistic, out of place in the world of Teyvat, like they'd been cut and pasted in from something set in our own world. For many others, the same technology was not an issue at all. It's just a shame people can't acknowledge that others may have a different perspective and instead turn it into a fight. When it comes to Columbina's moon, most of what I've seen so far feels cohesive with the world they've built and the mechanics of the universe we've been exploring so far. Even though it's very sci-fi, it feels fantastical. The environments on the moon are gorgeous and otherworldly, and the music gives it a slightly different feel to anything we've encountered on Teyvat, but the aesthetics rhyme and it feels part of the same universe to me. It's not all perfect though. For example, one thing which has thrown me out of the story ever since the start of Nod Krai was the use of the word spaceship. To me, it feels so out of place. It paints a world where spaceflight is a mundane, commonplace concept, which doesn't mesh with one whose modern cultures have barely reached the industrial age. I wish they'd chosen a more evocative term, which would have felt more like people grasping for an unfamiliar concept. As with the rest of their technology, whether or not all this feels well integrated with the rest of the game to you is highly subjective, and no one perspective is correct. For me, despite occasional blips like that, it's been mostly smooth sailing. And before we move on, I have to say the exploration gameplay on the moon has been fantastic. The low gravity made the same old gameplay feel novel, and I love that many of the puzzles had more physics interactions involved than usual. Bumping those balls around was tons of fun at times. The kuhenki in the forest area had so many playful interactions, and then the Moontide Sea was utterly stunning and had its own unique mix. Every moment was a spark of joy. It's easy for a game like Genshin to end up repeating the same formulas in slightly different ways, with each new region making incremental improvements on what came before. The Frost Moon feels to me like the developers themselves were were having more fun, finding ever more ways to be creative. The kind of joy which seeps through every moment of the experience and makes it all just come alive. I'm pretty sure I've still got a lot left to explore, but I'm loving it so far. The signature combat mechanic in Nod Krai was the Lunar reactions, and people were skeptical from the moment they were announced. Over previous years, the game's balance began to tip. HP inflation in the endgame accelerated, teams which had once been comfortable started feeling underpowered, and ones which had been borderline became completely unviable. Mechanics designed to advantage characters from each new region became more pronounced, and while it remains possible to clear without the shield mechanics, the level of investment and skill required slowly ticked ever upwards. People saw the Lunar reactions and felt they were just a lazy repackaging of the existing mechanics and an excuse to shill new characters once again. To me, they looked much like Nilo's bountiful blooms. My hope was that each character would be powerful and useful in a clear and narrow niche without breaking the balance even further. Putting Endgame aside for now, when it comes to how Lunar teams feel to play, I think it's important to look at the combat from multiple perspectives. I've had a more in-depth video about the different dimensions of combat complexity in my backlog for years, so I could easily go on about each for far too long, but I'll try to keep it short and stick to the two layers which are relevant. First, mechanical complexity. Genshin's combat keeps the actual button presses and combos fairly simple and doesn't require much mechanical skill or understanding to actually make the characters do their thing. At the end of the day, none of the Nod Krai characters do anything particularly unexpected. The on-field characters can feel fun to use if you happen to enjoy their attack sequences, while the supports are better left off-field and can unlock some powerful teams without affecting the surface level gameplay. The more engaging part of Genshin's combat is the second layer built on top, team building and rotations, where you need to understand the nuances of how the characters and their elements interact and take advantage of those combinations to get the best results. On this count, Lunar reactions have unlocked some interesting teams, many built around the Nod Krai DPS characters of course, but more importantly, there are several archetypes which became a lot more fun all of a sudden. Electrocharge now has some viable teams, so characters like Clorand are even better, and the Benefa duo can carry basically any combination, but it's definitely Lunar Crystallize which has been the most novel for me. Navia is always fun to use, so any fresh teams which make her feel even better are always a win for me. Generally speaking, what I want from any new mechanic in Genshin is for it to unlock new team archetypes and to make older characters feel relevant again. Viewed through this lens, the Lunar reactions have done a decent job. Some of the characters feel like a modern Nilo, while others bring something new to older characters. They're nowhere near as engaging as the introduction of Dendro way back in Sumeru, but overall they're fine. However, when it comes to Endgame, they're much more problematic. Hoyo have continued to ramp up the level of shilling, especially in the Stygian Onslaught, and even the Abyss is now functionally impossible for many of the old teams I used to rely on in the past. Way back in the early days, I used to actually replay the Abyss on occasion for fun, to test my weaker teams and see if I could figure out new combinations which would pass the bar. My builds aren't particularly optimized and I never bothered with stuff like crit fishing, but it felt like a fun challenge because it was possible. Those days are long gone. The only place which still captures that feeling on occasion is Imaginarium Theatre, which can still be fun at times. I have two main thoughts on this. First, in many ways, I no longer care. The important rewards are available at the lower difficulty levels, which are a formality at this point. If they were locked behind the harder challenges, then the shilling would be a bigger issue. As is, all they really gate is bragging rights. But second, and more importantly, the actual gameplay is not particularly fun or even challenging. If you have the shield characters, it's a walk in the park. If you don't, it's either near impossible, or you need to do some weird techniques and fish for perfect RNG. Neither experience is something I particularly enjoy, and it's mostly just stubbornness which has seen me keep up with Stygian so far. For example, for Wales, I imagine the whole experience is a joke. Again, this applies specifically to the harder levels of Stygian. I wish games like Genshin would learn from games like Hades. It's possible to create a challenging game which repeats and reuses the same mechanics and turns it into an incredibly compelling experience with progression and story embedded into the cycle and tons of variety provided through player choice, build direction, and RNG. One update I did not expect was that they're finally buffing older characters who had been left behind. It's interesting how they've integrated these buffs. In some cases, the character's base kit is outright improved, but even then, the full strength of their new abilities only gets unlocked when they're played with another character from the same category. A lot of people found that frustrating since it forces you to use the specific combinations, but even as someone who enjoys variety in team compositions more than most, this hasn't bothered me, even with characters like Nicole or Varka. I'd imagine it's more of a problem if you don't have all the options though. There were also some who were annoyed that unlocking these new buffs required them to play a quest, I guess. I'm unsure if that was actually genuine, because these quests are extremely short, less than 2 minutes in most cases, so it's wild to me that people would actually find that bothersome enough to complain about. I feel like this has been a net positive, with some interesting new teams showing up because of it. And Gigi becoming meta? It's wild just how different she feels with the changes to her kit, and it's so fantastic to see her suddenly become so valuable. I also think it's a grand joke on Hoyo's part to turn the most memed upon and hated character in the history of the game into a meta one. As with all the other combat points, the real problems with any mechanic like this only begin when accompanied by shilling and an uninteresting endgame. I'll be curious to see how this progresses in the future. And finally, Miliastra Wonderland. On the face of it, I should probably be the exact target market for this game mode. I've spent thousands of hours building things in creative sandbox games. I like dress-up games, even when there's gacha mechanics involved. And I love the idea of things like cooperative puzzle solving, which had seemed like such a great idea back when the Divine Ingenuity event first came out. And yet, when Miliastra came out, I had less than zero interest. Something about it just looked off to me, and I resented the fact that it kept pushing its way into my attention through notifications and events. I get why it's tied together. Asset sharing is highly valuable, and I'd even argue that some of the NPC model improvements we've seen in Nod Krai may be downstream of Miliastra. I still found it annoying. I signed up so I could try out that test dummy, but even that was annoyingly inconvenient when changing teams. But I kept coming back to at least get the Battle Pass rewards a few months when I bought that for the main game, and slowly stumbled on some fun little puzzle games people have built, and they're actually a fun way to spend a few minutes messing around after playing real genshin. It's never going to suck me in the way I'd have expected, but at least it's had some positives for me. Overall, for me, Nod Krai has been an easygoing and relaxing time, threaded through with a moving story which finally passed the quality bar I'd always hoped Hoyo would treat as the bare minimum for its storytelling. Even though I've probably played fewer hours of Genshin this past year than I have during any previous year, it's brought such a feeling of home and comfort along with those long-awaited improvements that it's probably become my favorite region, though I'll have to see how I feel after we get to re-experience Fontaine for my revisiting regions videos. With its announcement, Hoyo gave us specific promises. From my perspective, against all expectations, they actually delivered. Now they need to do it all again, except this time the stakes are even higher. So I guess I'll see you in Snezhnaya.